There we go. Call recording is on. I am Eric with Bell Performance. I'm the Technical Information Director here. And today's topic, as you can see, is just talking about how biofuels have changed the fuels that we use today. Back in November, we did a webinar where we wanted to talk about the general concept of how the fuels of today really aren't the same as they used to be, and we talked about some of the major drivers of that change and the big differences in the fuel properties, and then the implications that had for people who use the fuels. But we really didn't have time to cover what's really probably the biggest difference between fuel of today and fuel of 20 or 30 years ago, and that is the widespread presence of biofuels like biodiesel and ethanol in those fuels. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So we want to take a little journey. We wanted to explore a little bit the issues in a little bit more detail. So what we're going to talk about, basically, the aspects we're going to talk about are we're going to talk about how and why they have become so commonplace in gasoline and diesel. We're going to talk about the effects, both good and bad, because we'll say it a number of times, nothing is in 100% good or 100% bad. So we're going to talk about the effects that these have had on the fuels, some of the problems and issues that might be manifesting themselves where you're at, and then some of the best practice recommendations to try and solve some of those problems. So first thing, we've already said today's fuels are not the same. Fuels are a lot different than they were from yesteryear. The two big major reasons for those changes are increased demand on both a nationwide and a worldwide basis, and government regulation. That's a big one. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail later. But those two forces essentially have come together, and they've given us fuels that don't have as long storage life. They're more susceptible to microbial contamination. They don't burn as cleanly as they used to. And so in many ways, the fuels of today, they're of a lower quality than they were in the past. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the major reasons why that is with respect to these biofuels. Now, when we talk about biofuels, we're talking about biodiesel and we're talking about ethanol. And the biggest drivers for those ending up in our fuels are a couple of legislative pieces, the Clean Air Act and the Renewable Fuel Standard. These both together form essentially a legislative mandate to force change in fuel properties to help clean up the environment. Now, the Clean Air Act mandated the removal of sulfur from diesel fuel, which was the major driver or rather contributor for acid rain. It also required a change in gasoline composition to force the creation of these oxygenated gasolines, which, when they burn, will produce lower emissions and help urban air pollution, essentially. The Renewable Fuels Act came around in 2005, and this was really defined what was expected in more of a concrete way. Basically, the Renewable Fuels Act, one of the relevant aspects of it says, in the year 2016 or whatever, the United States is going to use X billions of gallons of fuels derived from renewable energy sources, which for our purposes means ethanol and biodiesel. So the reason we have them is because of these two legislative mandates. Now, the nuance to remember here is, whenever the average person considers, ethanol in gasoline, they always blame the EPA. And now the EPA certainly acts as an enforcement or an implementation arm, but the EPA is not to blame for having ethanol in our gasoline. Congress is to blame. Congress is the one making the mandate, and the EPA has to follow the directions of Congress as far as what Congress says should happen. So the EPA does get a bad rap a lot of times, but in this case, it's not 100% their fault. So let's talk a little bit about these two things. Let's talk about the diesel side first. talking about biodiesel in today's diesel fuels. Okay. Now, the first thing we have to remember is that most of the on-road diesel fuel that you see today will have some kind of biodiesel content in it. Biodiesel itself is, we call it a diesel-like fuel. It's essentially, it's fat and oil that have been chemically converted into something that burns closely enough to diesel fuel that you can put it in a diesel engine and run that engine without too many problems. Now, what we started off saying, we said most of the diesel you'll find today already has low levels of biodiesel mixed into it. The rules today basically say you can put up to 5% biodiesel content into diesel fuel and not disclose it essentially in any way. So you could have 2 or 3 or 4% biodiesel content in the diesel that you're buying at the pump, and it doesn't have to be changed with respect to its labeling in any way. It can just say diesel fuel. And the rationale behind that is they say, well, number 2 diesel fuel is defined by its properties, and if you put biodiesel into it in 2 or 3%, it doesn't change those properties, so you don't have to label it. So you're probably already using biodiesel to some extent without even knowing it. Now, why has it penetrated the market in the way that it has? Well, because it's made from fat and oil, it's considered a renewable fuel. So it has a renewable fuel status, and that plays pretty well politically. Politicians are always looking for ways to tell consumers, to tell their constituents, hey, I'm green, I'm environmentally friendly. And so it tends to be a positive political play to be in support of these renewable fuels. And it also satisfies the RFS, the Renewable Fuel Standard. Congress dictates that a certain amount of renewable fuels have to be used each year. Putting 2 or 3 or 4% or more biodiesel helps to meet that mandate. And when I say other political mandates, it's not just Congress. We're also talking about what I call mid and low-level politicians. The governor of Florida, Rick Scott, says, Florida's going to be more green, and we're going to direct our state agencies to buy more biofuels. Well, when he says that, then the county managers and the other agencies all the way on down the line all fall into line to try and be compliant with Governor Rick Scott's mandate. And so it's not just Congress saying it, it's all of these other politicians basically driving this mandate for having more renewable fuels. So let's talk about the good things about biodiesel. Well, apart from the economics issue of it, biodiesel from a fuel property standpoint is a pretty good fuel. It burns pretty well like conventional diesel fuel, which means that you can put it in up to 20% concentration, which is what's called B20. You can put it into mix it into diesel fuel up to 20% and have virtually no difference, operationally speaking, from a no meaningful difference essentially. And because of that, it won't affect your diesel engine warranties, for example. That was one of the big concerns that they had when it was first being introduced, is whether it would cause warranties to be voided. Well, if you have B20 that is properly within spec, it's not legal for an engine warranty company to say, well, you used B20, so you're out of luck with your warranty claim. Biodiesel produces environmentally friendly levels of emissions. In other words, it produces less emissions, which is one of the whole reasons why they want to use it. It replaces petroleum, which is partly a political issue, but if you're mixing 20% bio or 5% biodiesel, then that means you're using 20% or 5% less oil, and that's always a good play from a political standpoint. And then last major one, you can see high lubricity. When they were changing all of the diesel fuel over to ultra-low sulfur, one of the big concerns was the fact that they were stripping out the lubricity of the diesel fuel, which is an essential property that's needed to keep injectors and fuel pumps and other parts from wearing out. Well, if you take as little as 2% biodiesel, you put that into ultra-low sulfur diesel, you restore all of the lubricity that you had lost before. And that's a great thing for diesel users because it eliminates the need for them to look at separate lubricity additives. So it's definitely brought some good things to the marketplace. Now let's talk about some of the downsides that it has. Okay, first downside mainly what we're talking about microbes, we're talking about water, we're talking about stability, and we're talking about cold weather performance. Okay, biodiesel is an excellent food for microbes. Microbes love it. So biodiesel blends promote greater chance of microbial growth. They also increase the tendency for that diesel fuel to absorb water, which, since we just mentioned microbes, anytime you're talking about water, you always have to be concerned about microbes. Biodiesel is more hygroscopic than diesel fuel normally is. So it increases water absorption. And then stability and cold flow performance. Up north, cold weather performance, we're down here in Florida. Up north, cold weather performance in terms of gelling in cold weather is it's a big concern. And depending on what feedstock, what type of oil you make biodiesel from, you can have some biodiesels that gel and thicken at 40 or 50 degrees or 30 degrees, which if you're up in Michigan or Ohio, or if you're a farmer in Iowa, that's a big problem. And then stability. Biodiesel itself inherently has poorer stability tendencies than regular diesel fuel has. So that's the good and bad about biodiesel. Let's talk about ethanol and gasoline. That's the other major one. That's the one that probably gets more play in the media, more play with the average consumer. Virtually all on-road gasoline contains some amount of ethanol, as you see on the screen. It typically will contain up to 10%. In some states, you find up to 15%. And then you have these E85 pumps, which have 85% ethanol, 15% gasoline, and those are specifically for flex fuel vehicles that can run specifically on E85. Now, contrary to popular conception, ethanol in gasoline is not a 21st century invention, so to speak. Ethanol has actually been used in gasoline engines pretty much since the very beginning. The Model T, Henry Ford, 1909, it was designed to run on either ethanol or gasoline. Now, the amount of ethanol that the country has used, if you track that through the 20th century, it's gone kind of up and down depending on whether gas or oil was more or less expensive. But it's been around for a lot longer than people realize. So why are we using so much of it now? Well, in order to understand that, we got to go back to those government regulations. 1992, they make an amendment to the Clean Air Act that directs them. They say we have to reduce urban air pollution from gasoline, from gas-powered cars. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to require them to make reformulated gasoline, or sometimes called boutique gasolines. And what they're going to do is they're going to mandate that they mix these things called oxygenates, fuel oxygenates. They're going to blend those into the gasoline, and when you burn that new gasoline, it burns cleaner from an emissions standpoint. So far, so good. It is certainly an admirable, noble goal that they have right there. So what is an oxygenate? Well, an oxygenate, there are from a chemistry standpoint, there are lots of different things that you can put into gasoline to function as oxygenates. All they need to have is a high oxygen content. So you increase the oxygen content of the gasoline, you burn it, you produce less carbon monoxide and other harmful urban air pollutants, and over time, hopefully, you help to remediate some of this air pollution problem. Now, 1992, Congress says you got to start doing it. They say, okay, well, what can we put in it? Well, the first oxygenate that they considered was this thing called MTBE, which is an acronym for methyl tert butyl ether. So MTBE was already being used in load levels in the nation's gas supply as an anti-knock agent, as an octane, something to raise octane rating, mainly because of when they started phasing out the lead. They started taking the lead out around, I think, 1979, well, late 70s, and they started blending MTBE in there to try and replace some of that octane. So now they say, well, we can also use it as an oxygenate. So they start blending it in typically around 10% volume, and at its peak in 1999, they're using 8.5 million gallons every single day in the nation's fuel supply. So far so good. Everything seems to be great, except they start getting reports that MTBE is contaminating drinking water. Now, they're not so concerned that MTBE, causes cancer or causes birth defects or something like that. The biggest thing that they're concerned about is the fact that it just a little bit of it makes drinking water taste really, really bad. And when we're talking a little bit, we're talking about like parts per billion. There was an interesting stat that I read where if you took all of the drinking water that was needed to supply the drinking water needs for the entire 7 billion population of the world for their entire lives, 80 years, you took all of that water, you would need less than 8,000 gallons of MTBE to make that entire water amount undrinkable. Now, contrast 8,000 gallons to the fact that they were using 8.5 million gallons per day, and you've got a situation here. So the EPA says, hey, we can't keep using this anymore, so they start phasing it out. States start banning it in their on-road fuel around 2005, but they still have to satisfy the congressional mandate. So what are they going to do? Well, they have to have a replacement oxygenate. And anything that they replace, because they have options, but any replacement that they choose, it has to be inexpensive to make. You have to be able to produce it easily in large amounts. It has to be safe to handle because you're going to produce it in one place and you're going to get distributed out to all corners of the nation, and it has to be easy to transport. So the thing that they settled on was ethyl alcohol, ethanol. And ethanol meets, from a logistics standpoint, it meets all of those requirements. It's easy to produce. It's safe to handle. It's relatively inexpensive to produce, all things considered. So ethanol becomes the replacement. And again, we said nothing is 100% good and nothing is 100% bad. Well, same thing applies to ethanol. Ethanol has some good points. It's got a high octane content, which means that like MTBE, they're able to not only use it as an oxygenate, but they're also able to use it to help make up some of the octane requirement of the finished gasoline. And so for the refiners, that's good because they can, if they're trying to make an 89 octane gasoline, well, maybe they start with an 86 base stock and they add their 10% ethanol, and depending on how the math works out, maybe that gives them their 3 extra points. And so, they've killed 2 birds with 1 stone. Second good thing, of course, is that it is easily made from corn and other plants. It's been made by people for millennia, so it's obviously people know how to make it. Right now, as of 2014, the nation was using about 14 billion gallons of ethanol per year. As you can see from the graph, that graph graphs the amount of ethanol production in the United States relative to year, and relative to year. And you can see that around 2006, 2007, the curve really started spiking upwards. But now we're at a point where ethanol production is leveling off because we've kind of reached the tipping point of relative to the amount of gas that's used in the nation and the amount that they're supposed to put in, they've kind of reached the saturation point. Now, an interesting thing to consider is that for years, when you looked at 2008, 2009, 2010, on up, every year the amount of ethanol that was going to be used kept going up and up and up and up. But now they're at the point where they say, well, we can't increase it anymore. And so Congress has actually, for the past couple of years, been debating whether they should scale back ethanol use, which, again, is completely reverses the trend of the recent past. Now, the thing to consider here, and this is something that we're going to talk about when we touch on a couple of the problems with ethanol. The thing to consider is that the Renewable Fuel Standard says in a given year, the nation is going to use X billion, 14 billion gallons of ethanol is what the nation has to use. So they have to take that 14 billion gallons and mix it in at a 10% max or 15% max in the nation's gasoline supply. And if you can project accurately how much gasoline the nation uses, then your math works out and everybody's happy. However, the government has been putting pressure, continual pressure on automakers to make more and more efficient cars. You hear about the CAFE standards and the requirement that by the year 2035 the average fuel economy has to be 50 miles per gallon, something like that. Well, the automakers have done a better than expected job at doing that, and so we're actually using less gas now as a nation than they were expecting. So you got less gas to mix this ethanol in. They now have a dilemma because they still want the nation to use 14 billion gallons, but they have less gas to put it in. Well, the mathematical solution is just increase the percentage. Well, unfortunately, because people tend to take gas for their car and use it in their lawnmower and their small equipment and their boats, things that you're not supposed to put it in, you got a problem. You can't just change the percentage. So when you hear them talking about Congress debating the ethanol mandate, quote unquote, the ethanol mandate, that's kind of the underlying issue that they're discussing there. All right, what's good about ethanol here? Let's talk about the good and the bad. Similar to biodiesel. Number one, we've already said it's an oxygenate, reduces emissions from gasoline, reduces carbon monoxide, reduces other ground level ozone production, the kinds of emissions that are terrible for urban air quality. So it reduces emissions. And like biodiesel, it volumetrically reduces the amount of oil that we're using. If you put 10% ethanol in gasoline, that's 10% less petroleum that you're using. Those are the two main good things about it. But people forget about the good things because they want to concentrate on the bad things. So, and there's plenty of bad things to talk about when you're talking about ethanol. Let's start from a consumer standpoint. Let's start from what I term a macro consumer standpoint. Ethanol has made food more expensive. It makes food prices go up. Depending on the source that you look at, right now, anywhere in the United States, anywhere from 25 to 40% of the nation's corn supply is not being used to make food anymore. It's being diverted to make fuel. And so that by simple supply and demand, that means anything that uses corn to produce food, talking about meat, beef and dairy and pork, eggs for chickens, anything that has corn syrup and corn content, all that stuff, the food prices, the prices to make those are going up. And that is largely attributed to the ethanol fuel problem. Second problem, lower energy content. And anytime you have lower energy content, everything else being equal, you get less mileage. That's the thing that resonates most directly with consumers, but it's also a business concern too. We're going to talk a little bit about the issues of scaling, the cost scaling here. For consumer, the amount of mileage that they're losing when they're having to use E10 gasoline, it's probably about 3 to 4%. I mean, ethanol itself, if you compare it gallon to gallon, it has 30% less energy. But you're not burning 100% ethanol, you're burning 10%. So a 3 to 4% reduction in fuel economy probably costs them a couple $100 a year. A couple $100 is a couple $100 you could be spending someplace else, but for a lot of consumers it's not that noticeable. But if you are a municipality, if you're a business, if you have a fleet of gas-powered vehicles you've got 15 vehicles and they drive X thousands of miles per year, you take that loss and you multiply by that scale, you're talking about a much larger concern for businesses here. Material damage here. This is where we start getting into if you use ethanol in small equipment, lawnmowers, weed whackers, so to speak. When ethanol stays in contact with these polymer parts, the rubber and the plastic, over time it will dissolve those polymers, it will soften them, and it will cause damage. When ethanol started really spiking around 2007, 2008, one thing you saw was a really sharp uptick in the business that small engine repair shops are doing, because people were coming in with busted fuel lines, their seals were being eaten, they had corrosion in their small engine carburetors. It was pretty apparent. In fact, if you Google it, you'll see references on local newscasts about the repair shops having to deal with this problem. And from a consumer standpoint, nobody wants to have to spend $100 to get another weed whacker. But from a business standpoint, again, it's an issue of scale. If you have a municipality that has 100 pieces of equipment that they have to use to maintain, municipal grounds or whatever, you start talking about the fact that they're not looking at $100 or $200, they're looking at thousands of dollars because of this ethanol solvency problem. Now, we mentioned small engines. Okay, small engines and ethanol do not play well. Ethanol causes corrosion to the carburetors, as you can see, and for two-stroke engines where you have fuel oil lubrication, well, ethanol tends to attract water, and that water attraction will interfere with that lubrication and can cause catastrophic engine damage and destroy that small engine. Now, that may not seem like a big deal. Maybe that's being overplayed, you might think. But it's a serious enough problem that small engine manufacturers are coming out specifically and warning people not to use more than 10% ethanol. This is Briggs & Stratton, an official statement from Briggs & Stratton. There are other official statements you can find. If you Google it, you can find the Echo had one as well. It's basically, do not use unapproved fuels such as E15 ethanol because it'll damage the engine and it will void your warranty. So, and if you've been in a place like Home Depot, you might have seen I think that they actually have a partnership with small engine retailers called the Look Before You Pump campaign. It's just basically a little one. They have a logo. They put up signs in the small engine department saying, hey, if you buy this lawnmower, don't put E15 in it because it will destroy the engine. So it's a serious enough problem that the engine manufacturers, who don't usually do this kind of thing, they're trying to warn consumers about the problem. So that, and again, a few minutes we were talking about the congressional debate over ethanol, and this is one of the reasons why they have a problem, because, again, less gasoline to mix ethanol in. They say, well, if we still want to use 14 billion gallons of ethanol, well, then let's just change from 10% to 15%. Well, you can't do that because people are going to take that E15, and which is now all they're going to be able to find at the pump. They're going to fill their gas cans with it and put it in their lawnmower, and now they're going to have issues. They're going to be doing exactly what Briggs & Stratton and Echo and others are warning them not to. That's why there's a problem with the ethanol debate that Congress has to figure out an answer to. All right. Now let's transition into more business issues. We talked about things, the mileage and the small equipment damage and food prices. That's, by and large, those are things that consumers are concerned about. But businesses are the ones that really have a lot at stake because they're not worried about losing $100. They're worried about the 5 or 6 figure costs, capital costs and investments that they have sunk into their fuel management. So with businesses, the problems with ethanol being so widespread in the fuel. First, poor storage stability. It used to be that you could get 1 to 2 years out of regular gasoline back in the day. Now, if you have gasoline that's got 10% ethanol mixed into it, your storage life can be as little as a month. It's a big difference between a month and 2 years. Why is that? Well, mainly caused by this phenomenon called phase separation. Now, phase separation, in order to understand the phenomenon, we've already mentioned that ethanol, alcohols in general, are hygroscopic, just like biodiesel. They're hygroscopic. That means they attract water. So if you have a 10% ethanol blend, it will attract water and absorb water out of the environment, out of the air around it. Now, all gasoline has a limit to the amount of water that it can absorb. If it crosses that limit, then what happens is the ethanol, the alcohol that used to be seamlessly blended into it, will start to separate out. It'll start to drop out. It will carry water with it, and you'll get a layer of ethanol-rich water, as you see on the illustration there. You'll get a layer of ethanol-rich water at the bottom of the storage tank, and then the gasoline is sitting on top. That is phase-separated gasoline. Now, the question that comes to mind is, so what? Why is this a problem? Well, it's a problem because, in general, phase separation destroys fuel quality. Now, there's a couple problems here. First one is if an engine happens to get some of that ethanol water, let's say it gets drawn up into the fuel intake line, and it was burning gasoline, all of a sudden it gets a slug of this alcohol and water. The alcohol and water burns at a higher temperature than the gasoline, and you can get pretty serious catastrophic valve or engine damage if that happens. So that's kind of a catastrophic scenario. The more likely scenario is the problem of stripping the octane out of the gasoline. Remember, we said that refiners use that 10% ethanol mandate to help make up part of that octane value. If some of that ethanol drops out of the gasoline, it's going to lose the gasoline that's left is going to have lost actually more octane than the ethanol contributed to. And what I mean is, if it was an 86 base gasoline, and which means 3 octane points were being contributed by the ethanol, and let's say theoretically that all of that ethanol drops out, the octane value that's left behind in the gasoline that's left behind isn't just going to be 86. It's probably going to be 85 or 84, because the ethanol will actually strip out more of the octane than it contributed. And so what you're left behind with many times is a layer of gasoline that is extremely poor quality, may not even burn properly. And that's a huge problem when you're talking about any kind of critical use engine or mission critical area which has gasoline in there that has to power something that needs to work on a moment's notice. If you're not confident that the gasoline in there will do what it needs to when you need it to, well, then you've got some headaches. You've got some real problems. So phase separation is a huge reason why gasoline does not have anywhere near the storage life that it used to have. All right, third one, tank corrosion. Ethanol corrodes and damages storage tanks over time because of 2 things. First thing is that it attracts water, as we said, and as you would expect, anytime you have water contacting metallic parts, whether you're in a storage tank or whether you're outside, it's the same thing. It contributes to corrosion damage. Second thing is that we said earlier that ethanol and biofuels are excellent fuels for microbes. Well, there are certain kinds of microbes that love to consume ethanol. And when they consume ethanol, they produce acetic acid, and that acetic acid will corrode tank parts both below the fuel line and also above the fuel line. That's where you see acid vapor corrosion. The acetic acid that's being produced by these microbes will actually vaporize and go up into the air above the fuel line and will start to corrode the tank above the fuel line. So when you're talking about tank storage and tank maintenance recommendations, a lot of tank manufacturers will say, look inside the tank and check the upper parts of the tank. And if you see corrosive indicators there, then it's a strong indicator that there's even worse damage down below because you're seeing acid vapor corrosion damage. And anytime you're talking about tank corrosion, you're talking about serious impact on your budget, because tank corrosion to replace parts and replace damaged tanks is a really, really expensive proposition. That's where it really starts getting expensive for businesses. And diesel users are not immune to this ethanol corrosion problem. That's because you have a lot of the same trucks that transport diesel fuel to diesel users are also used to transport ethanol gasoline, and many times they are not cleaned out, as well as they could be, and so there are a lot of diesel users out there who store diesel who are getting trace amounts of ethanol and ethanol gasoline in their diesel. And these ethanol-consuming bacteria, they will find those trace amounts, and they feed on them. They produce acids, and there are very real and serious instances of corrosion damage in diesel tanks because of trace ethanol, switch loading contamination. So diesel users are not immune to this. All right. So those are the main issues. Main issues with biodiesel, main issues with ethanol. Now we come down to the nitty-gritty. Some of those may resonate with you. You may have seen examples of some of those, or you may be in an industry or know somebody in an industry where if one of those problems happens, they've got some real serious headaches they have to deal with. So people always want to know what's the best practice recommendation to solve the problems. All right, so we'll summarize some of these. Okay, number one. Now, some of this stuff we've already talked about, so we're not going to spend a lot of time. We're just going to briefly touch on these points to set up some context for the solution. Okay, first one, ethanol damage to small engines. Just talked about that a couple minutes ago. The problem is that softens and damages rubber parts, causes corrosion in the carburetors, interferes with the lubrication because of the characteristics of ethanol, the fact that it's an excellent solvent, the fact that it's hygroscopic and attracts water. Anyone who uses small engines and gas-powered equipment, whether it's a consumer or on a larger scale, business like municipality or landscape maintenance companies, they're all have the potential to be adversely affected by this. Now, the recommended measures to combat this problem, a couple of things. If you're done using a piece of equipment, like for example, you're getting ready to put it up for the winter, they always recommend draining the fuel out. There's no more fuel in there to have ongoing contact with the polymer parts. That's one thing that they recommend that you do. The only other thing that you can really do to combat this is essentially treat the fuel. And you treat it with a multifunction, essentially a fuel protectant, okay? There's a lot of options of those out there. We're not going to go into specific names of things. Obviously, Bell Performance has manufactured solutions for this. There's a lot of other things that are all kind of holding up their hands in the marketplace saying, oh, yeah, I do that as well. But our purpose is not to tell you which one to buy specifically. Our purpose is to tell you what you want to look for, the characteristics that you want to look for here. And what you want to look for is three main things. It has to have something that acts as a surface protectant. Essentially, it creates a boundary layer of protection on everywhere, all the surfaces that the fuel touches. And that boundary protection essentially acts as a shield or as a protective layer and helps to slow the solvency damage phenomenon. It also needs to have detergency because anytime you put ethanol in an engine, it's going to start, if it's dissolving any of the polymers, those polymers end up being deposited in other areas of the engine. And that's what causes performance problems, if not total destruction of the engine. So you need something that's got a good detergent package in it to help carry these things through to the combustion chamber and get them out of there where they can be burned. And then big one, it needs to fight phase separation. And what we mean by that is it needs to improve the ethanol blend's ability to absorb water and resist its urge for the alcohol to separate out. So those are the three main things that you need to look for. Related problem, phase separation and storage. We talked about the fact that storage life was so much less than previously, and that's because the problem, drop out of dissolved ethanol and gasoline because it has absorbed too much water, and because of that, you're essentially the gasoline that's left behind, its fuel quality, its combustion quality, has been destroyed. And anyone who stores gasoline, mostly on the B2B side, are going to be affected. Again, most consumers, the only skin they have in the game really is they might have a couple gallon gas canister that they store gas in. But a municipality, a business that has a fleet of gas-powered vehicles, that maybe have a fuel storage tank, now you're talking about big investments in that fuel, and which are put at risk by this phase separation phenomenon. We just said a minute ago what the recommended measure would be. You can't keep the fuel from absorbing water. You just can't do that. So what you need to do is you need to treat it with something that improves the fuel's ability to absorb water and resist this phase separation. That's really about the only thing that you can do as a preventive measure to keep that from happening. Storage tank corrosion. Big problem, big expensive problem because of because of two main things: water absorption from the environment and acidic byproducts from microbes that live in the fuel and in the storage tank. And again, anyone who stores fuel has the potential to be affected by this. So the recommended measures. Okay, three main recommended measures. Keep the free water under control by checking the tank for water and removing the free water layer as often as possible. If you do it once a month, you're probably ahead of the game compared to everyone else. So at least once a month you need to do that. And then you need to apply biocides, a biocide treatment to the fuel, and that is the only thing that will actually kill the microbes, keep them under control. And then the third one, there are anti-corrosion tank treatments which act in the same way as these ethanol protectants do. They have fairly low treat rates. Bell Performance has one of them called the tank treatment SCF. There are other things you can use as well. So that's the third recommended measure that you can use. Ted has asked, a lot of talk about gasoline. Are these measures all the same for diesel fuel? Well, since you asked, we are actually getting ready to transition into the biggest problem that diesel fuel has. So, and then of course we can talk more about diesel fuel at the end as well. So we will definitely see if we can answer that question for you, Ted. Fourth one. Fuel and tank microbes. This is your diesel problem, Ted. The biggest problem, probably the single biggest problem that stored diesel fuel has, is microbial growth over time. We could do a whole 1 or 2 hour webinar just on fuel microbes. In fact, we probably will at some point in the future. We're just going to touch on the main highlights here because we're coming down towards the end of this. But this is shaping up to be probably the biggest concern that across the entire nation for diesel users is microbe problems. Because the main focus of this is biofuels. Biodiesel has combined with the requirement to make ultra-low sulfur diesel, those two things have come together and caused an explosion in the instances of microbial growth in diesel fuel tanks. And the microbes cause tank corrosion. They do other things like cause excessive filter plugging. They destroy fuel quality because of the byproducts of biological respiration. They cause huge problems. And a unique nuance of microbe problems in fuel tanks is they spread easily anywhere that fuel goes. So if you have a microbe problem in a central storage tank and you don't do anything about it, or you don't even know it's there, and then you fuel equipment and vehicles from that tank, those microbes will spread into the vehicles, and suddenly you don't just have to clean out one tank, you have to clean out 100 tanks or 500 tanks or whatever. So microbes are a huge, huge problem for diesel users. So again, anyone who stores fuel, both biodiesel and ethanol, and of course regular diesel, they're all affected by fuel and tank microbes. Recommended measures. Again, we could talk for an hour about this, but we only have a few minutes. So the main measures are you have to do two things. You have to reduce the conditions that microbes find amenable for growing, and then you have to do things to kill and get rid of the existing microbes. And so what we mean by that, reducing the conditions. Sometimes those are rolled into what they call housekeeping measures. But for microbes, the main thing that falls under is controlling this free water buildup. Water is essential for microbes to have to grow. They need it. Virtually all tanks over time develop free water. I mean, that's just the way it is out in the field. So when you have a free water layer at the bottom, you have a place that microbes can draw what they need from the water, draw what they need from the fuel. They got everything they need to grow and thrive and build up and cause problems in that tank. So at least monthly, you need to check the water. You need to see if you can remove the free water. That's the housekeeping measures. But that is not enough to be 100% sure you're never going to have a problem. And the reason for that is because of the ultra-low sulfur diesel. See, way back in the day, back in the 80s and the early 90s and before that, the conventional wisdom was that if you kept the water under control, then you would not have microbe problems. And the reason why they thought that was because the fuel had a lot higher sulfur content back then. Sulfur is a natural, we call it a natural biocide, but it's a preventive. Microbes do not like to be around sulfur. So those fuels were a lot more resistant to microbial growth. 2006, 2007, ultra-low sulfur diesel. They're taking all the sulfur out of the diesel fuel because of the Clean Air Act. Now, these diesel fuels have no resistance to microbes. Then when you start blending biodiesel into them, they have no resistance and they have extra stuff put into them that microbes love to feed off of. So microbial problems in diesel tanks are a huge, huge problem, and simple housekeeping measures of just controlling free water will not keep them at bay forever. In order to keep them at bay, to solve the problem, you need to use regular biocide treatment, not water controllers. There's a difference. Use of biocides. Treating a biocide at least once a quarter will kill the microbes in the tank and is your best bet for keeping them from coming back and causing a problem. Now, this is extremely important, and Ted talked about what the measures for diesel fuel. That's why we want to talk a little bit more about this in a brief fashion, because this is really, really important for anyone who has stored diesel. There are a lot of things that call themselves biocides out there. If you're trying to figure out the best one to have, you need to have these characteristics. So we'll touch on them briefly. Broad spectrum means it kills all of the kinds of microbes, bacteria, and fungus that are typically found. Fast acting, typically you want it to get a complete kill once it's properly mixed in within a couple of hours. Long lasting kill. 4 weeks is about the industry, the top of the line that you're going to get out of a biocide. The thing to remember is biocides are not something that you put into the fuel once a year and you come back and they're still working. Biocides, when they kill microbes over time, they get used up. And 4 weeks is about the best you're going to get. That's what our biocide, Belicide, has. There are others that only last for 1 to 2 weeks. So you want something that will last as long as possible. Dual phase effectiveness, what that means is since there's water and fuel in storage tanks, then you need to have something that kills microbes in both areas. The most popular biocide, which is BioBor, actually gets deactivated in water, and that actually makes it least effective out of the major biocides. And then the last one, registration with the EPA. This is the one that really separates the most valid ones from the ones that might claim to be biocides but really aren't. If you pick up a biocide packet, let's say you have you get visited by a salesman, and the salesman says, yeah, I got your biocide right here, use this. And you look on the bottle, it has to have 2 EPA registration numbers on it. If it doesn't, then that means it's not registered with the EPA, which means, first of all, it's illegal to use it as a biocide, and second of all, you probably can't trust anything that that company's telling you, because the only legitimate biocides are the ones that are registered with the EPA. Now, Lily asked, are biocides dangerous for humans? Absolutely they are. They are required to be registered with the EPA pesticide division. So when we say they're dangerous for humans, what we mean is about the same as if you had something that you were using, like a weed killer or a pesticide of some kind. That means you don't want to ingest them, you want to handle them properly. They'll have an MSDS that will give you the safety instructions. As long as you follow the safety instructions, you will be fine. But there are things that you do not want to be lax about handling, because they are things designed to kill biological organisms. That brings us really to the end of the webinar here. The important takeaways, since we're running up on time, we'll just you can see those if you access the recording. But basically, both biodiesel and ethanol have caused the fuels to change in an adverse way. There are solutions for those, whether it's both housekeeping measures and also use of fuel treatment methods. So, that's basically the summation of what we've been talking about today. Ethanol blended gasoline causes small equipment damage, lowers your mileage, corrodes tanks, but there are solutions to all of these. So, as we wrap this up, if you haven't been to the Bell website before, most of you probably have. So we just wanted to remind you that we have a lot of helpful resources at bellperformance.com and at wefixfuel.com. The resources also at the Bell blog, which you can go to bellperformance.com/blog, or you can click on the blog link, which is located in here. We have both a commercial and a consumer blog. So we really, that's probably the single best place on our site to find information on the nuances of all of these things. So, and then the last thing that I wanted to touch on, for people who have stored fuel, or people that have stored fuel, we're introducing this thing called the Bell FPS program, which is a service aspect. It's Bell Fuel and Tank Services. And we really started this because we started having a lot of customers really on the municipal end who, they know that they need to treat the fuel, but they need more of a full service offering. And so we use what we call a hybrid approach, where we do fuel cleaning and fuel polishing. We take the best aspects of that, and we combine that with the best, the best and most effective chemical problem-solving agents to try and then we also combine that with fuel testing and diagnostics to ensure that if someone's got a problem, we help them identify what that problem is and how best to solve it. So if that's something that resonates with you, then by all means, give us a call afterwards, send us an email, and we'll talk a little bit more about it with you. Ted wanted to ask, since we're at the questions part here, Ted says, how do you ensure that these products will meet manufacturer specs to avoid liabilities concerns should engine problems occur due to use of these third-party products? That's an excellent question. The first thing that comes to mind, if you're talking about on-road fuel additives, like what you would use if you were treating stored ethanol or stored on-road diesel. That's considered on-road fuel. It's going into on-road engines. And so all fuel additives that are intended to go into on-road fuel, they have to be registered with the EPA. And the reason they have to register to the EPA is the EPA essentially looks at the formula and makes an assessment that there's nothing in those fuel additives that will harm the engine. Essentially nothing in there that is chemically unlike what's already in the fuel. And that gives the consumer protection when it comes to, comes to the question, well, if I put this thing that I've never heard of into my engine, how do I know it's not going to blow up? Well, if it's legally and properly registered with the EPA, that is a tremendous safeguard to ensure that that's probably not going to happen. Now, there may be some other nuances to that. Ted, what I would suggest is get in touch with me afterwards, and we can discuss that your question a little bit further, unless I've already answered essentially what you needed to know. I mean, the only other main aspect or main thing of concern with respect to Ted's question about liability and manufacturers is that there are some manufacturers who will write that they do not want people to use fuel additives. Now, on the one hand, there's a difference between saying we don't want you to use it or we don't recommend that you use it versus don't use it or we won't honor your warranty. Those are two separate things, and there's a lot of legal gray area between those two sides, because on the one hand, engine manufacturers, they're not in the business of recommending fuel additives. What they're in the business of is selling more engines. So they need to essentially indemnify themselves or give themselves as much cushion so that they can, so that they don't have to spend time analyzing what fuel additives are good, what fuel additives are bad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's not really a legal precedent for engine manufacturers to make a blanket decision. If you added anything to your fuel, then you're not going to get your warranty claim honored. Part of the reason for that is because gasoline and diesel already has certain kinds of additives already in it from the refinery. So they're already, behind the eight ball with respect to that. So hopefully I've addressed the nuances of your question, Ted. If not, then send me an email that's up on the screen. Get in contact with me afterwards, and I'll be glad to discuss further with you, because it's definitely a worthwhile question. All right, well, that brings us to the end of our webinar. It's 12:03, and I think that we've covered everything. So thanks very much for joining me. Again, if you have any questions, email me. Check out the website. If you're interested in Bell FTS or further information on anything that we talked about today, absolutely give me a call. Otherwise, thanks for joining me, and we're going to do our next webinar sometime in the second quarter of the year. So hopefully we'll see you then. Oh, last thing. All of you are going to be getting an email that is going to have the link to access the recording of this. We're going to ask you a couple of evaluation questions. How did I do? Did you like the sound of my voice? Do you need a different presenter? Are there any other topics you want? Basically, how can we make this better? We appreciate if you just give us some input on how things, good or bad. We're interested in both sides. So everyone will be getting an email, and you'll have access to the recording. All right. Well, thanks for joining me today, and we'll talk to you again later. Thanks very much.